Broadband penetration and economic growth. My name is John Hoagie, and this is for EPM 4910. An overview of what we're going to cover today has to start with what the definitions of both broadband and economic growth are. So broadband is a high-capacity transmission technique using a wide variety of frequencies, which enables a large number of messages to be communicated simultaneously. Economic growth is an increase in the amount of goods and services produced per head of the population over a period of time. That leads us into my research question, which is, what has the economic impact of disruptive broadband implementation been across developed nations? So, covering my 5 studies, the first of which is financial depth, internet penetration rates, and economic growth, country panel evidence. The purpose of this study was that this article set out to find any relationship between financial depth, internet penetration rates, and finally the per capita economic growth in their sample. Their sample was the annual data from 2001 to 2012 of N11 countries. N11 countries were made up of Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, South Korea, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, Turkey, and Vietnam. Their design for their research looked at a few different areas, those being financial depth, penetration rates among internet users, per capita economic growth, penetration rates of penetration rates of internet servers, and overall internet penetration rates. So between those, they did multiple models to look at how these affected each other. What they found was that, as they quoted, we find that internet penetration rates, financial depth, and per capita economic growth are co-integrated. This gives implications that countries that promote higher rates of internet penetration will see greater long-term financial growth rates. This leads us to my second study, which was entitled Broadband Infrastructure and Economic Growth, the purpose of which is to look to see the economic output per capita due to broadband penetration. The description being, and I quote, accordingly, endogenous growth theory suggests that broadband infrastructure should accelerate economic growth by facilitating the development and adoption of innovation processes. Their sample was from an annual panel data from 31 different countries during the period of 1998 to 2010. How they took this data is that they put these into a data table and used a software program called Stata, which is a statistics and data analysis tool. And how they laid it out in the data table was by GDP worker, percent with broadband, total communication access, gross fixed capital formation, and percent labor with tertiary education. So their software program produced multiple mathematical models and implications between these. And these implications led to them finding that a 10% increase in broadband penetration growth resulted in 0.035% raise in economic GDP or economic growth per employee, And to quote them, our findings also add further weight to call for governments to adopt policies that accelerate broadband penetration and promote investment in broadband infrastructure. Study number 3 was titled Broadband Penetration and Economic Growth Nexus, Evidence from Cross-Country Panel Data. The purpose of this study was to investigate the relationship between urbanization, economic growth, broadband penetration, and direct investments. The description of this study was that there are many factors that accompany economic growth in developed nations. This study looked for causal relationships between and across a number of potentially limiting factors to find what factors impacted a nation's economic progress. The population or sample was data from the World Bank on 19 G20 countries from the period of 1998 to 2011. Their design came with, the design started with countries being divided into 2 separate groups, one of which being developing countries and 2 already developed countries. So their analysis took a multivariate approach across 4 different measures, the first being GDP, the second being total percentage of the total population that are broadband users, which they denoted as BBD, percentage of population that resides in urban areas, which was denoted as URB, and finally, the inflows of foreign direct investment, known as FDI. The implications from their study were, unlike the other studies, this was a multivariative approach. The others were bivariative, looking only across 2 different variables, whereas this was across 4. And they concluded that there was no causal link between broadband penetration and economic growth for either developed or developing nations. So this study shows that more comprehensive analysis need to be done before governments should promote the wide adoption of broadband. Study 4, broadband infrastructure and economic growth. The purpose of this study was an estimation of the effect of broadband infrastructure on economic growth. The study uses an instrumental variable model to examine pre-existing voice and cable networks to determine broadband penetration. These penetration examinations are compared against the economic growth across different geographic locations. The population or sample was a panel of 20 OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries for the period of 1996 to 2007. Their research design modeled broadband penetration and economic growth in 6 different ways, which were used to estimate their effects. What they found and the implications from their study is that for every 10% increase in broadband penetration, we see an increase in GDP annual growth per capita at a rate of 0.65 to 0.91%. And again, this study implies that the increased broadband GDP grows, meaning that it behooves governmental bodies to further its growth of broadband penetration. The last study that I examined was broadband availability and economic growth. This research mathematically models the effect of broadband availability on economic growth. The description of the study is that across a grouping of countries that are all a part of the same organization for growth, are examined to look for correlations between the availability of broadband to residential users against the growth of GDP. The population sample for this was data from a cross-country panel of 34 OECD countries over the years 1998 to 2009. The research design for this study, and a quote, is the effect of the broadband availability related variables on economic growth is analyzed by using cross-country data for 34 OECD countries over the years 1998 through 2009. The robustness of this results by the 6 econometric estimation approaches is compared. The preferable dynamic panel model with the system of generalized method of moments is selected. And their implications, and I quote again, is the access channels per inhabitant and total broadband per inhabitant have improved over time, but vary across the analyzed OECD countries. The improved access channels per inhabitant and capital growth play a positive and significant role in the per capita GDP growth. Labor productivity growth has encouraged economic growth positively, and these results are robust independently of the estimation procedure. Those are the 5 studies that I reviewed for this assignment. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen.